So, in the last lesson, chapter 2, we looked at um, natural selection and Mendelian genetics. And these two things combined are what we call the evolutionary synthesis. And those four mechanisms the four mechanisms that are at work in evolution are natural selection, mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. Those four things are really what we talk about when we say evolution. Those are the four mechanistic principles that take place that drive evolution and push it give it direction. We ended our discussion last class talking about how the discovery of the structure of DNA allowed us the ability to unravel it and actually understand what it was. And this chapter chapter 3 is really doing a deep dive into genetics, what genes are and how they behave in you, and importantly how they give rise to you as an individual. So this is an anthropology class. We're interested in what humans are and what makes up our sameness and differentness, and part of that is genetic. But as we're going to see, genes are sort of a blueprint. You can't use genetics to excuse yourself from any behavior that you do. That's up to you. That is, you're the product of your genes, but you are not only your genes. There's more to it than that. And chapter 4, that we'll come to next class, will be discussing how genes take instructions and then the body develops from that. And that's the genotype creating the phenotype. I want to start today by taking you back in time to a very, very long time ago. But I just want to say that this chapter and the next chapter I consider to be the most, probably the most challenging in this course, because it's really microbiology and developmental biology that we're dealing with, and it gets very specific. You're going to have to learn some terms. So as I said before, I encourage you to go to the end of the chapter and learn those glossary terms, know what they mean, and understand why they're there in that chapter, what those terms mean in terms of what we're learning right now. So I'm going to throw these certain terminology at you, and if you don't understand one of the words that I'm saying, please go and find out in the book. All that information is there. I'm not going to be mentioning anything that goes beyond what the book talks about. So let's start a very, very long time ago with the first life on Earth. I know this is a course on anthropology, and humans aren't 3.5 billion years old, but the first life on Earth does appear to be about 3.5 billion years old. And this was a time when the earliest life was just single-celled organisms, microscopic beings that we call prokaryotes. And prokaryotes still exist today. They're not extinct, although some versions of them are no longer around. But it's I suppose this is a good point to spell out a principle about extinction and development, that in nature, complexity doesn't mean better. We tend to prioritize ourselves. This is a very anthropocentric way of looking at things, that because we are talking about ourselves, that we prioritize ourselves and say that we are better than other creatures. I don't mean this to be harsh, but you are not better than a prokaryote. You are not better than a single-celled organisms. You're not better than a cockroach. You're not better than a squirrel. That's not the way. It's not about being better. Being more complex, having a brain, doesn't make you better biologically. And in fact, if there's no reason to change evolutionarily, then it's probably best to stay the way you are. Change is something that that is we put in terms of adaptation. And I talked a little bit about adaptation last chapter, that adaptations are neither good nor bad. They are situational. And so if the environment changes, what was once a very good set of characteristics for one organism that allowed them to survive, if those conditions change, then if you don't adapt, then you might not survive and pass those characteristics on to the next generation. So prokaryotes are still around. They're the earliest life on Earth that we know of. All of those creatures are dead, but that form of single-celled organisms still exists today. And that's because it's successful. Now, are there other ways of finding success in other environments? Yes, and we're going to come to how natural selection has selected different forms of life, and certain advantages have created new forms. This is what evolution is. And it may not seem very obvious why we're talking about single-celled organisms in a class about humans, but you are made up of single cells. You have more than 1 trillion cells in your body, and each one of those is sort of an independent organism in its own way. It's guided by a single blueprint that tells it each of these cells to cooperate with the other cells, but you are made up of single cells. So we'll come to this in a moment, but prokaryotes are extremely simple. They are basically just blobs of DNA, and we'll talk about what DNA here is in a moment, surrounded by a membrane and with some moving parts that allow them to move around and absorb nutrition from the environment, and then eventually split into two and reproduce. It's just sort of like self-reproducing DNA. And in fact, prokaryotes are the first or the earliest form of single-celled organism life that we know of, but they might have even been preceded by viruses. That's possible too. A virus is really just a strand of RNA, ribonucleic acid, with legs that moves it around, and there's even some debate as to whether it's truly alive or not. It's a mechanistic process. They actually tend to take over other forms of life, but viruses may very well be a form of life that it emerges just from the chemicals that make up life coming together and then reproducing. So there's no need in this to have any outside source that produces this life. As we'll talk about when we come to what DNA is, well, actually, I might as well talk about that right now. DNA, as we're going to look very in depth into the structure, we talked a little bit about that with Watson, Crick, and Franklin last chapter, where the structure, the double helix structure of DNA was unraveled, and we understood how it came together. Now, I'll come back to this, but essentially I want you to use this metaphor to try and understand what DNA is. We all know what magnets are, right? So you've got a magnet with a positive and a negative charge on either end of it. Let's say a sort of a magnet that's in the shape of a rectangle. One end is positive, the other is negative. If it comes up close to another magnet that has a positive and a negative charge as well, one end of that is going to repel its counterposing magnet, right? So if you try to put two magnets together that are charged against one another, you can push and try, and you might even be able to put them together, but they're not going to stick, right? They'll push themselves apart. This magnetic field just pushes them apart. Likewise, if you turn that other magnet around and you put the attracted ends to one another, you don't even have to bring them all the way in close to one another. They'll pull themselves together and they'll stick together, and you've got to actually exert some pressure to separate them. Now, essentially, DNA is a strand of a bunch of magnets that have positive and negative charges to them. That's not really the way it is, but you can think of that in terms of these magnets. And we use shorthand that these are A and a T are attracted to one another, and a G and a C are attracted to one another. But you will never get an A to a G. They are opposed to one another. So if you take enough magnets and you put them into a bag and you shake the bag up, you're going to have those magnets find and attract to one another and link up. And you're never going to have a negatively charged magnets coming and sticking together. So there's really only one way it works. Those that are attracted to one another will find one another and attach. Those that are not will repel and keep searching for one that they find that they're looking for. So these we'll look a little bit more about the way that DNA functions, but essentially there's no real trick to this. These are just chemicals that exist on Earth that are found their way together and exist in a strand, a long string of these chemicals, and in a prokaryote, it's just a mixed, jumbled up strand of DNA in what's called a cytoplasm, which is the sort of goo inside of this sort of capsule, and it's got these little flagellum that allow them to go through a soup and pick up nutrition. They absorb that nutrition, and that nutrition includes more of these magnet type things, these nucleotide base pairs that can then attach to other ones, and they can replicate their strand of DNA. Once they've built up another strand of DNA identical to the one that they had before, then they separate and they become two cells. This is an extremely simple process. It's done almost mechanistically. We can call it life, but it is extremely mechanical. And prokaryotes, there's no complexity to them at all. There's no nucleus, there's no center point, there's no brain, there's no intention. They don't want to do this, they just are doing it. They don't have any organs, they don't have any extra bits, and this works extremely well. And the reason why it works well is because more moving parts requires more nutrition. It requires more organization, and it requires more effort. And if a cell, a prokaryote that is extremely simple, can separate and create a copy of itself, then that same system is going to be copied. And then that one will copy, and that one will copy. That's extremely successful. But if you're slowed down by more complex systems and organelles and nucleus and all sorts of different cooperative things that are involved in your way of existing, that's a drag. That's a drag on your existence. You need more to do less. And that means that you may not be as successful if you have more complexity. So complexity is actually something that nature kind of pushes back on a little bit. If you can do the same job, that is to say replicate your DNA very simply, that's something that's going to be successful. Now, prokaryotes were so successful that they continued on for about 2 billion years. 2 billion years. That's about half of the time that the Earth has been around. And they were really the only form of life that existed. So that's pretty successful, right? 2 billion years is longer than every other form of life has been around on the Earth. All the rest of the life has been on Earth. So prokaryotes were the only game in town for more than the whole rest of the living things have been around. But about 1.2 billion years ago, a new type of life started to emerge. And this is what's called a eukaryote, Y-O-T-E. A eukaryote is more complex. Now, this is a lesson for what we're going to look at in natural selection for the rest of the course. That why would something more complex come in and be successful? Because prokaryotes did such a good job very simply and without any excess baggage that were dragging them down. Why would eukaryotes, which are more complex, come into existence and be successful? And in fact, eukaryotes are now the dominant life form on Earth. Well, if you're going to be more complex, you had better, those complex features had better help you to outcompete everyone else, right? So complexity isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if that complexity exists, if you have more stuff going on, that had better bring you in more nutrition that helps you to reproduce better, faster, and get there and outcompete your competitors, right? So prokaryotes are doing a very good job very simply, and eukaryotes, their challenge is to do it better in a more complex way. And it worked, right? So eukaryotes have what are called nuclei or nucleus to their cellular structure, and in much the same way as a prokaryote, they're just sort of a membrane that surrounds a cytoplasm. But in that cytoplasm, rather than just this jumbled up bit of DNA, it's organized into things like organelles, little tiny organs that do specific functions. We'll look a little bit closer at some of these later on. And the nucleus, which is a little package of DNA right in the center. And that organizes and efficiently uses the DNA, and then they can reproduce by splitting the nucleus within the cell, and then the cell separates into two nuclei. So this is a lot more complex than a simple prokaryote, but what must have occurred is that this new, more complex system must have been more efficient and done a better job at competing for resources in the environment that existed 1.2 billion years ago. Now, the reason why this is important for you and me in anthropology is because every single cell in your body is basically a eukaryote. You're not made up of prokaryotes. You are made up of these more complex but single-celled organisms that are all share, every single one of them, every one of your trillion cells in your body is like its own independent organism, but they have share the same DNA as every other cell in your body, which means they have the same set of instructions for what to do, how to live their life, and they cooperate to create an individual organism made up of these cells that are cooperating. Now, why would cells cooperate? They didn't do this 1.2 billion years ago when single cells were existing. Well, maybe think of it this way. Let's say there's a limited amount of resources in a pond or a primordial soup that exists. And you're competing for these resources. You're not thinking about it, you're just a single cell. If you get those resources before your competitors, then you will reproduce and your characteristics will be passed on to the next generation. And if you don't, then sorry, tough luck. When you die, you don't have any offspring. But let's say you're a really fast swimmer, that you have really powerful flagella that whip their little tails towards these nutrients and get you there first. And so that's a really good competitive advantage to be able to move quickly, right? But maybe you aren't very good at digesting or absorbing this nutrition. And so the slow walker, the tortoise eukaryote comes and the hare is already there trying to process this nutrition, but the slower one comes and is more efficient at digesting and absorbing this nutrition. Now they may have gotten there later, but they might actually be more successful at at absorbing that nutrition, and then they outcompete the faster one. So it's great to be fast, but you've also got to have other stuff going on. Also, maybe the one that has really good digestion and absorbs nutrition really well doesn't have a very efficient nuclear structure, and it doesn't separate very easily, whereas there's another one that just reproduces very, very quickly and very rapidly. They might actually reproduce more than the ones that got there first, or the ones that digested the most. The one that actually reproduces the most could actually outcompete and have more offspring than the other two. That's all great, right? So it's great to have adaptations, right, and things that make you more successful. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen for you to be successful in evolution. Now, what would happen if the good digester, the one with the easel that digests this nutrition, piggybacked on the fast swimmer? That's great. You can use some other cell to get there first and digest. But if you don't give any to that if you don't give any of your nutrition or allow that fast mover to reproduce, then you won't have that fast mover the next time you need to get to a spot where there's nutrition needed. And so you might cooperate, right? You might share resources between the fast mover, the good digester, and the good reproducer, the good organizer. And now we can see that cells might actually be more successful if they can combine their unique abilities together to create multicellular organisms that then can outcompete any single-celled organism that's out there. You're kind of the result of this process that you have, but it's actually guided by a single set of DNA, a single set of instructions for building all these different cells that are, it's in their structure to cooperate with one another. And so if you look at your what are called somatic cells, your body cells under a microscope, they very much resemble these eukaryotic single-celled organisms. So your heart cells, your lung cells, your brain cells, your liver cells, your bone cells, your skin cells, everything that you've got in your body, they look like eukaryotes. They all have a nucleus, they all have organelles, they all have a membrane and cytoplasm. They're all existing independently of one another, but guided by the same principles with the same DNA, the same instructions. They all have the same blueprints, and they're all working towards the same goal. And these somatic cells replicate like prokaryotes do. They gather up enough nutrients